On the morning of May 30, 1431, the city of Rouen stirred before sunrise. Church bells rang with a cold, metallic echo across the grey stone streets as crowds formed around the Via March, the old market square. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through the air, mixing with the sharp scent of wet wood. By mid-morning, thousands would witness what they believed to be justice, punishment, or divine tragedy. Few understood the truth. They were about to watch the deliberate destruction of an 18 or 19-year-old girl whose only crime had been believing her visions were real and fighting for her nation when no one else had the courage. Her name was Joan d'Arc, later known to history as Joan of Arc, and her execution would become one of the most haunting moments of the late Middle Ages. To understand why this moment became so horrifying, one must go back to the political chaos that shaped Joan's brief but extraordinary life. France in the early 15th century was a broken kingdom. The 100 Years' War had ravaged its land for generations, and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had nearly erased the French monarchy by recognizing England's King Henry V as heir to the French throne. The legitimate heir, Charles Roman VII, had been pushed into the margins of political power, mocked as the King of Burges. Much of northern France, including Paris, was controlled by the English or their allies, the Burgundians. French morale was shattered. Armies refused to fight. Cities surrendered without resistance. Many believed France was finished. Into this hopeless world stepped a teenage peasant girl from the remote village of Domremy. Joan claimed that since the age of 13, she had received visions from saints instructing her to save France and lead Charles Roman VII to his coronation. In normal circumstances, such claims would have been dismissed or even punished. But France was desperate. Rumors of miraculous guidance spread quickly. When Joan finally met Charles Roman VII at Chinon in 1429, she spoke with such conviction and certainty that many believed she had been divinely chosen. Whether one believes her visions were real, psychological, or shaped by the world around her, there is no denying that Joan possessed an extraordinary presence. She inspired soldiers who had long given up hope and revived a national spirit that had been nearly extinguished. The following months became legendary. Joan led French armies into battle during the siege of Orleans and achieved what seemed impossible. The English, confident in their strength, were forced to retreat. Joan's courage was undeniable. She fought at the front lines, carried her banner into combat, and rallied soldiers with an intensity that transformed the momentum of the war. By the summer of 1429, she escorted Charles Roman VII to Reims, where he was crowned king. This single act shifted the entire political balance of the 100 Years' War. Joan had restored legitimacy to the French throne, and with it, hope. But such power made her dangerous to many powerful men. The English viewed her as a threat to their claim over France. The Burgundians resented her influence. Some within Charles Roman VII's own court feared that Joan, a young peasant girl, had become more popular and politically influential than the king himself. Joan's victories uplifted France, but they also produced powerful enemies who saw her not as a liberator, but as an unpredictable force that had to be removed. Her downfall began in May 1430, when she was captured outside Compiègne by Burgundian forces. Rather than working for her release, the French leadership hesitated, feared, and ultimately distanced themselves from her. The English quickly paid for her custody, determined to destroy her public image. Joan's trial would not be one of justice but of propaganda, designed to dismantle the spiritual authority she represented. At Rouen, a court of pro-English clergy convened to judge her. The trial was overseen by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, whose loyalties lay firmly with England. From the beginning, the trial violated church law. Joan was denied legal counsel, interrogated for hours each day, and held in a military prison instead of a church prison. The judges twisted her words, pressured her to contradict herself, and sought to force her into statements they could use against her. The charges against her were numerous, but they centered around one core accusation: her visions. The court argued that her voices were not divine but demonic. Her wearing of male clothing was labeled a sin. Her role in battle was described as unnatural for a woman. Joan defended herself with remarkable intelligence, often turning the questions back on her interrogators. But the outcome had been predetermined. Her execution needed to appear legally justified, so she was declared guilty of heresy. Under threat of immediate burning, Joan signed an abjuration, agreeing to abandon her visions and dress as a woman. But the English and their allies were not satisfied. They wanted her dead, not imprisoned. Days later, Joan was found wearing male clothing again. She claimed that guards had attempted to violate her and that she reclaimed her old clothes for protection, since they could be fastened tighter. The court seized this as proof that she had relapsed into heresy. A relapse meant automatic execution. The final sentence was delivered swiftly. Joan, hearing it, wept but did not beg. She asked only for a cross. What happened next would become one of the most brutal public executions of medieval Europe. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was led from a prison cell to the old market square. She was chained to a tall wooden stake, surrounded by bundles of wood piled so high they nearly reached her waist. English soldiers stood in tight formation, both to maintain order and to shield her from any last-minute rescue attempt. Clergy recited prayers, some mocked her, others trembled at her composure. Joan asked for a cross to hold. A sympathetic English soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. Another brought the processional cross from a nearby church, so she could gaze upon it as the flames rose. Before the executioner lit the fire, Joan called out to the crowd, insisting that her voices had come from God and that she had never betrayed her faith. Many witnesses later said that her words moved even hardened soldiers to tears. When the fire began to burn, the flames rose slowly at first, then surged upward with frightening speed. The executioners deliberately built the pyre in a way that prolonged suffering rather than granting quick death. The smoke choked the air. Joan's cries echoed through the square, soaked in terror and unbearable pain. Her death was not quick. It was slow, agonizing, and meant to destroy not only her life, but her legend. Yet her execution had the opposite effect. Instead of erasing her memory, it ignited a story that would only grow stronger. France rallied behind her sacrifice. Even some English soldiers later admitted they believed they had killed a saint. When the flames finally died, the executioners raked the ashes and exposed her charred remains to prove she was truly dead. The bones were burned again until nothing recognizable remained. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine so no shrine could be built. But no river could wash away what she had become, a symbol of courage, faith, and resistance. When Joan of Arc awoke in her cold, dim cell inside Rouen Castle on May 30, 1431, she understood that this day would be her last. The clanging of iron keys, the murmurs of guards, and the faint echo of church bells outside told her what was coming even before her jailers opened the door. But to understand why this execution became one of the most horrifying spectacles of the medieval age, we must first understand the political desperation and fear that drove powerful men to burn a teenage girl alive with the harshest measures imaginable. Joan's trial had been a theatre of manipulation, crafted carefully by men who feared the influence she carried. Her victories at Orleans and Patay had not been mere military successes. They had reignited French nationalism, restored the hope of ordinary people, and embarrassed the English, who believed they had nearly completed the conquest of France. Her influence became so strong that even high-ranking nobles worried that she threatened established authority. Kings relied on armies, money, and noble families. Joan relied on faith, charisma, and the belief that she had been chosen by God. That kind of power frightened monarchs more than enemy swords. After her capture at Campigny in 1430, her enemies wasted no time. The English paid a hefty sum to the Burgundians to purchase her like a political weapon. They hoped to use her trial to delegitimize Charles Roman VII by framing Joan as a heretic. If she could be declared guilty of sorcery or demonic influence, then the king's coronation that she facilitated could be seen as invalid. In medieval Europe, the church and monarchy were deeply interconnected. A king anointed through the help of a heretic would be seen as a king without divine approval. This is why Joan's enemies were obsessed with proving that her voices were not divine. They repeatedly interrogated her about her visions, trying to force her to contradict herself. Her claim that Saint Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine had guided her became the central point of attack. If they could portray these visions as lies or hallucinations, they could transform her victories from divine miracles into dangerous rebellion. The trial at Rouen was controlled entirely by pro-English clergy. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, led the proceedings. Cauchon had long, standing ties to the English and owed his political survival to their support. He saw Joan not as a misguided girl, but as a threat to a political order he deeply desired to protect. Other men in the tribunal shared similar loyalties. Every word Joan spoke was written down, scrutinized, and twisted into arguments for her destruction. Yet Joan's intelligence stunned them. She was uneducated by the standards of the elite, but her memory, clarity, and reasoning were far superior to what her judges expected. When asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her, she replied with remarkable wisdom, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Her answer stunned her interrogators because it avoided the theological trap they had set for her. Despite her brilliance, the trial was never about truth. It was about eliminating her voice forever. In a moment of exhaustion and fear, threatened with immediate execution, Joan signed an abjuration renouncing her visions, but the English did not want her imprisoned. They wanted her dead. When she was found wearing male clothing days later, they claimed she had relapsed into heresy. The explanation she gave, that guards had attempted to violate her and that male clothing protected her, was ignored. Her fate was sealed. The final night before her execution, Joan was visited by priests, guards, and observers. Many expected her to break down completely. Instead, she asked for confession and the Eucharist. Even the priest who administered them later reported that Joan showed more courage than the men around her. She admitted to fearing the pain she would soon suffer, but she faced it with a calmness that many witnesses described as heartbreaking. At dawn, soldiers entered her cell. They tied her hands not roughly but firmly, as if acknowledging that she had already accepted her death. As she walked out of the castle, the streets were lined with soldiers ensuring no rescue attempt would take place. The people of Rouen crowded the roads, some curious, some sympathetic, and some resentful of the English occupation. But when they saw Joan in simple clothing, escorted by priests, many bowed their heads or wept quietly. By the time she reached the old market square, a platform had already been raised. The pyre beneath the wooden stake towered above the crowd. The English built it intentionally high, surrounding Joan with wood on all sides, designed to prolong the burning and ensure that the crowd could not see her body too clearly once the flames began. This was not only an execution, but a spectacle of psychological warfare. The moment Joan saw the stake, she trembled. She prayed softly. She asked for a cross. A kind-hearted English soldier, moved by her courage, broke 2 small sticks and tied them together to create one. Another priest brought the ceremonial cross from Saint-So, for witnesses later said that Joan's face lit up with relief when she saw it. She repeated the name of Jesus as if it were the last anchor she had left. Before the fire was lit, she addressed the crowd in a strong voice. Some chronicles recorded her saying that her voices came from God, not the devil. Others noted that she forgave her enemies and asked God to pardon them. The English commanders ordered the executioners to begin quickly, fearing that the crowd would become sympathetic or rebellious. The flames rose slowly at first, licking the lower branches of the wood pile. Smoke drifted upward, stinging her eyes. Joan cried out, not only in pain but in fear. She called to Jesus again and again. The fire climbed higher, surrounding her legs, then her torso. The smoke thickened, turning the air dark. Eyewitnesses described the smell of burning cloth and the deep, agonizing screams echoing through the square. Some witnesses wrote that Joan asked for water. Others said she cried for a priest to hold the cross higher so she could keep her eyes fixed on it. Even English soldiers reportedly wept at the sight. Roger de Warwick, an English secretary, later confessed that he had never seen a death so cruel. The fire was not allowed to fully engulf her at first. The English had arranged the pyre so the flames would torture her before killing her. Only after long minutes of suffering did the smoke and heat overwhelm her. Many said her final word was Jesus, shouted loud enough that people at the far end of the square heard it. But the horror did not end with her death. English commanders ordered the ashes to be inspected. They wanted to ensure Joan had actually died, fearing stories that she had escaped. When the executioner raked the ashes, he found her heart still intact. Shaken, he told church officials that he believed Joan was innocent. Instead of reflecting on this, the authorities ordered him to burn the remains again. Only when nothing recognizable was left did they gather the ashes and throw them into the Seine River. They hoped to erase her forever. Instead, they immortalized her. When the smoke from Joan of Arc's pyre finally drifted away above the rooftops of Rouen on May 30, 1431, a strange and unsettling silence settled across the old market square. Thousands of people who had filled the streets to witness the execution stood frozen, their expressions marked by shock, disbelief, or sorrow. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others looked away, unable to erase the image of the young girl crying out for Jesus as flames swallowed her. Even hardened English soldiers, men who had fought in brutal battles, were left shaken. They had expected to watch a heretic punished. Instead, they felt as though they had participated in the killing of a saint. But the horror of Joan's death did not end that day, nor did the political consequences. Her execution would haunt Europe for decades. It would turn into a powerful symbol of injustice, and it would eventually reshape the outcome of the 100 Years' War. Yet to understand how her death created such a profound shift, we must look beyond the pyre itself and examine the world that consumed her. Joan's rise from an ordinary village girl to a legendary figure had happened in just 2 extraordinary years. Before 1429, she was unknown outside her small village of Domremy. After 1429, she became the hope of France. Her victories broke English momentum after years of domination. She revived the morale of soldiers, liberated key cities, and escorted Charles Roman VII to be crowned at Rheims. The impact was so enormous that Winston Churchill, centuries later, described her as one of the most remarkable people ever to appear in European history. But in 1431, while she was being executed, none of her accomplishments protected her. Her allies were distant, and her enemies were determined. The English believed that killing Joan would crush French resistance. They believed that burning her would demoralize anyone who still saw her as the chosen savior of France. What they did not realize was that the brutality they unleashed would have the opposite effect. After Joan's execution, rumors began to spread almost immediately. Word traveled through Rouen that the executioner had wept as he burned her. People whispered that her heart had not been consumed by fire, even after the pyre was relit a second time. Others claimed they had seen a white dove rise from the flames, a sign of divine purity. Whether these stories were true or born of grief, they took on a life of their own. They spread across villages, towns, and cities already resentful of English occupation. Meanwhile, in the court of Charles Roman VII, Joan's death forced uncomfortable questions. Why had the king not ransomed her? Why had he not negotiated her release? Why had he allowed the hero who delivered him his crown to be abandoned? Some historians argue that Charles feared Joan's growing influence and that her capture provided an opportunity for him to regain control. Others believe that the chaos of war, political pressure, and Joan's own unpredictable decisions made it difficult for Charles to intervene. Regardless of the reason, one fact was clear. Joan's death created guilt that the French monarchy could not ignore. As the years passed, the guilt, the rumors, and the lingering horror of her execution blended into something powerful. Joan became a martyr in the eyes of many. People who once doubted her now saw her as a symbol of French identity, courage, and divine justice. Songs and stories were whispered about her around hearths at night. Her memory refused to die, but the English did not gain the control they hoped for. Instead, the moral backlash weakened them. The Burgundians, who had once been their strongest allies, drifted back toward the French side. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras ended the alliance between England and Burgundy, a devastating blow for English ambitions. Soon after, French forces began capturing city after city. By 1450, Normandy fell. By 1453, the English lost almost all their territory in France except for Calais. The land Joan had fought to save finally returned to French rule, and the girl the English hoped to erase became a national icon. Yet the most important transformation happened not on the battlefield, but in the halls of law and memory. Charles Roman VII could no longer ignore the injustice that had been done to the teenager who risked her life for him. To restore his own legitimacy, he ordered an investigation into Joan's trial. This inquiry, known as the Rehabilitation Trial, began in 1450 and intensified in 1452 and 1455. It gathered testimonies from more than 100 witnesses. Priests, soldiers, villagers, and even some of the men who had participated in Joan's trial spoke openly. Many admitted that her earlier trial had been rigged. They revealed that evidence had been twisted, that legal procedures had been violated, and that political pressure had been immense. Some witnesses described how Joan's interrogators had trapped her with complicated theological questions. Others testified that she had been deprived of proper counsel, kept in chains, and guarded by men who harassed her. They spoke of her bravery, her clarity, and her unbroken devotion to her faith, even in the face of death. But the most chilling testimonies came from those who described the execution itself. One recounted how the wood had been piled unusually high to prolong the suffering. Another revealed that English commanders had insisted on keeping the fire burning even after Joan had died, determined that no relic or bone would survive. The executioner himself confessed that he had feared for his own soul after burning her. After months of testimony and examination, the court declared Joan innocent. On July 7, 1456, 25 years after her death, Joan of Arc was officially exonerated and recognized as a martyr. Pierre Cauchon, the bishop who had orchestrated her trial, was condemned for heresy and corruption. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in medieval history. A girl once branded a heretic had now been declared a saintly victim of political manipulation. But even this vindication could not erase the physical brutality she had endured. People who heard the details of the execution after the rehabilitation trial were horrified. They learned that Joan had not been strangled before burning, as sometimes happened in mercy killings. Instead, she had been fully conscious when flames rose around her. They learned that she had cried for Jesus again and again. They learned that she had begged a priest to hold up the cross until her final breath. These details became embedded in the cultural memory of France. Artists painted scenes of her death. Poets wrote verses honoring her courage. Chroniclers described her suffering in heartbreaking detail. Her story crossed borders, becoming known throughout Europe and centuries later around the world. Joan's memory continued to grow long after the flames at Rouen died out. In 1909, the Catholic Church beatified her. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. Today, she is recognized not only as one of France's greatest heroines, but as one of the most powerful symbols of faith, resistance, and courage in global history. Her execution was meant to silence her forever. Instead, it transformed her into a legend. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc on May 30, 1431, were intended to erase her from history. Her enemies believed that by destroying her body, humiliating her reputation, and scattering her ashes into the Seine, they could extinguish the movement she had created, but the opposite happened. Joan's death became a wound on the conscience of Europe, a spark that grew into legend, and a turning point that shaped the future of France. To understand the full weight of her story, one must examine not only the brutality of her execution, but the global legacy she forged through her courage, faith, and sacrifice. After her ashes were thrown into the river, England believed it had finally shattered the symbol that threatened its dominance in France. But in reality, Joan's death marked the beginning of the end for them. In the months following her execution, people across northern France whispered openly about their anger and grief. Mothers spoke to children about the girl who led armies. Soldiers told stories of her battlefield miracles. Priests quietly questioned how the Church could allow such an injustice. Even English sympathizers felt uneasy. They had witnessed fear in the eyes of their commanders, not triumph. This emotional undercurrent spread across cities and villages. Joan had become more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. Her execution gave France something it had lacked for decades: unity. The French people began to rally around her memory, seeing her as the embodiment of hope, faith, and national identity. While Joan had been a living symbol of courage, she was still human. After death, she transformed into something larger. She became a martyr, a spiritual force, and a reminder of what France could accomplish when it stood together. The rehabilitation of her reputation began quietly in the 1440s, after Charles Roman VII regained several territories. But by the early 1450s, Joan's vindication became a royal priority. Charles Roman VII needed to solidify his legitimacy, and proving that the girl who placed a crown on his head had been unjustly condemned strengthened his authority. He commissioned a formal inquiry into her trial, which grew into one of the most extraordinary legal proceedings in medieval Europe. During the rehabilitation trial, witnesses from all levels of society testified. They spoke about Joan's humility, her unwavering faith, her battlefield leadership, and her compassion. They recounted how she had treated prisoners with mercy, refusing to allow unnecessary bloodshed. Soldiers who had marched beside her described her as fearless. Priests who had heard her confessions said her devotion was genuine. Even some who had once doubted her now admitted that they believed she had been chosen for a divine purpose. Through these testimonies, the world learned more about Joan than ever before. They discovered how she would pray before every battle, spend nights in silence and contemplation, and refuse all personal glory. She never asked for riches or titles. She wore armor because it protected her, not because she sought the appearance of power. She obeyed orders, respected hierarchy, and remained humble despite her sudden fame. The rehabilitation trial also exposed the corruption behind her original trial. It revealed how Pierre Cochon manipulated legal procedures, denied her proper counsel, and pressured clergy to condemn her. It revealed how the English demanded a guilty verdict and controlled the direction of the trial with threats and bribes. Witnesses described how Joan had been held in a military prison guarded by men who harassed and frightened her, violating church law. They described her courage under interrogation and her refusal to deny the visions that guided her. The The most haunting revelations, however, came from accounts of her final hours. Priests told the court how Joan had asked for a cross before dying. One described how her voice rang out across the square as she prayed, even while flames climbed around her. Another recalled how the executioner trembled after the fire died down and admitted that he believed he had burned an innocent soul. These testimonies shocked the church and the monarchy. Joan's death was no longer merely a political matter. It was a spiritual tragedy. On July 7, 1456, a quarter century after she died, Joan of Arc was declared innocent. The church annulled her conviction, recognizing that she had been condemned unjustly through political manipulation. Her name was restored, her honor was returned, and her memory, already powerful, became unbreakable. But Joan's story did not stop there. Over the next centuries, she rose from national heroine to global icon. Writers, artists, poets, and historians across Europe rediscovered her story and retold it in countless forms. She inspired soldiers, revolutionaries, activists, and political leaders. Her image became a symbol of resistance and courage during the French Revolution, the Napoleonic era, the Franco-Prussian War, and both world wars. By the 19th century, her legend had grown so vast that calls for her sainthood intensified. In 1909, the Catholic Church beatified her. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint. She became one of the most revered figures in Catholic history and one of the most celebrated heroines in global culture. Joan's legacy reaches far beyond religion or nationalism. She stands as a symbol of moral courage, a reminder that one person, no matter their background, can change the course of history. Her life demonstrates that leadership is not defined by birth or wealth, but by conviction. Her story reveals how fear, envy, and political corruption can destroy the innocent. And her death teaches that sacrifice in the name of justice can echo through centuries. Modern historians describe Joan not only as a warrior, but as a revolutionary thinker. She challenged gender norms by wearing armor and commanding armies. She challenged political norms by guiding a king to his throne. She challenged religious norms by claiming direct communication with saints. Whether one views her visions as spiritual truth or psychological phenomenon, there is no denying the impact they had on the world. Most importantly, Joan's execution remains one of the clearest examples of how powerful institutions can use fear and falsehoods to destroy those who threaten their control. Her trial was designed to break her spirit. But Joan refused to surrender her beliefs. Even at the stake, she cried out to God with such conviction that witnesses remembered her voice for decades. In the end, the horror of her execution lies not only in the flames that consumed her, but in the courage she displayed as she faced them. She did not die quietly. She did not die forgotten. She died with the same strength that carried her through battle, guided her through visions, and made her one of the most extraordinary figures of medieval history. Today, Joan of Arc stands as a reminder that truth survives even when the body does not, that conviction survives even when the world turns against you, that courage survives even in the face of fire. She was burned to silence her. Instead, she became eternal.